Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the Hilton, Sydney, for this evening for Education Inequality, Unfinished Business, a panel discussion in the Says Who series at the University of New South Wales, a series of provocative conversations in public. It's also an event of the UNSW Arts and Social Sciences Faculty Showcase. It's wonderful to see so many distinguished guests, our industry partners and community partners, senior members of the university, as well as members of the Advisory Council and many of our staff and students tonight. It's a pleasure to have you all with us for this all-important exploration of the challenges associated with achieving equality in education. Now, a few notes of sort of administrative notes for the night. We'll be filming and recording this event so we can share this discussion beyond this evening. The filming will focus on the conversation between the panelists rather than on individual audience members. However, should you wish not to be appearing in future filmings or future viewings of this film, please let a member of our staff know as you're leaving. It's my pleasure now to invite Auntie Barbara Sims-Keeley from the La Perouse Aboriginal community that's been a long-standing partner of UNSW to deliver the welcome to country. So, Auntie Barbara.
Thank you, Susan. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, our elders that are here tonight, I pay respect to you as well. The Honourable Adrian Peckerley and his UNSW School of Education Director, Gonski Institute for Education. The Honourable Jihad Dib, Shadow Minister for Education, New South Wales Government. Lila Malachik, OAM, Director of Secondary Schools Education, New South Wales, Department of Education, and a fellow worker indeed, thank you. We worked together at James Mann High School some years ago. Wow. Professor Mary O'Kane, AC, New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer. Facilitator, we have Alexandria Smith, Education Editor, Sydney Morning Herald. From my community, La Perouse, where I'm a First Nations woman, traditional owner, custodian. I am born on the land here in Gadigal country. I am born in Crown Street, Sydney, some 48 years ago, or rather 70 years ago, 1948 I was born. I do apologise. The wrinkles show, have a look. The wrinkles do show, so I wish I could say they're born 48 years ago. I am the proud mother of 5 children, 15 foster children, 19 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren. I enjoy what I do. This is my dad's country here, first and foremost. We extend to Homebush Bay, foot of the Blue Mountains, Camden, Liverpool. My father's great-grandmother was born in Liverpool, Queen Emma Timberi. My mum's country is from Mount Ousley Down, Yuin country, a Wandian woman. I'm the daughter of Barbara and Pat Sims, very proud Indigenous woman I am. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow colleague here, Khalida Murray, an Aboriginal educator at Soldiers Settlement School. It's people like Khalida that are in schools that open up the doors with Aboriginal education to make sure things are done right and proper, that you add a perspective wherever applicable. If it's not there, then ask why not. And we talk about equity. Tonight's session is Education and Equity, Unfinished Business. So I often wonder, is it unfinished business or is it just starting? We need to know this and we need to ask questions and find out why. If not, why not? I come from one of the oldest contact communities of La Perouse, where Aboriginal women and men today have still not left country. The oldest Aboriginal man around is at La Perouse. The oldest women are at La Perouse. So I can really fondly and warmly say that. They are my people, my mob. Also my clients that I look after in aged care, so I enjoy what I do. I did spend some time in education, James Mann High School, Ashcroft High School, Nowra East Primary School, on a split site with 150 Aboriginal students in them, as well as non-Aboriginal kids within, and working with some great principals indeed. So if your school has a great principal, really, you've got a great partnership. It's the end of his word, PAL. Is he your pal? I'd like to think so. So that's what I look at when I look at principals as well. One of the directors as well, Murat Dista, he worked with us at Ashcroft High School, first year out science teacher, so he was there with us as well. So I've worked with some really brilliant people back then, and now I'm in aged care and I see things differently. It's about our older people getting older and looking after those as well. So they should get what they need and belong to. And working in partnership with non-Aboriginal people as well. So my role is not just about working with the Aboriginal elder people. I must and foremost work with non-Aboriginal women, men and women, to show them we can walk in partnership. We do all suffer the same illnesses. We don't all bleed black and red colours. So we bleed that multitude of colours. No. I, myself, you, sir, sitting in front of me, we bleed red blood together. We live in a great land, a country that is free. It's rich in diversity, uniqueness, and we as Aboriginal people have been welcoming people to this land for hundreds of thousands of years. We've walked in harmony with you. We've shared with you. Today we share together in questions and hope they can be answered as well. So for my elders, both past and present, to the elders that are here today, I bid you welcome all. As a Aboriginal woman, thank you, take care, safe travels home, walk in harmony and unity. Thank you.
Thank you, Aunt Barbara. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to their elders, both past and present, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here tonight. I'd now like to invite you to watch a short video from David Gonski, the Chancellor of UNSW, for whom the new UNSW Gonski Institute for Education has been named. The Gonski Institute will be formally launched in early 2018, so this event is a kind of tracer for great things to come. The Institute, which is affiliated with the School of Education at UNSW's Arts and Social Sciences, is an interdisciplinary institute created to deliver excellence, access, and equity in education. These strategic goals align with UNSW's 2025 strategy pillars: academic excellence, social engagement, and global impact. The Institute will be officially launched in approximately March of next year, but we have a short welcome to you from our Chancellor, David Gonski.
Ladies and gentlemen, please accept my apologies that I'm not with you this evening. I really wanted to be there, but unfortunately I'm overseas at the time you're watching this. To me, the evening that you're about to have sounds fantastic, and it is a great privilege for me to be able to welcome each and every one of you to the UNSW Arts and Social Sciences Says Who, a panel discussion on education and equality, unfinished business. And what a panel that has been put together. I'm going to eagerly listen to what happens and hear the outcome of the discussions, but I know with those sort of people on the panel, it's going to be fabulous. Those of us who were involved in the report which bears my name, at least colloquially, in 2011, were absolutely certain that disadvantage, that is educational disadvantage, has a correlation towards not performing well in educational matters. This, in our opinion, is something that had to be looked at. And I'm absolutely delighted that my university, the University of New South Wales, is now going to spend time and put together effort under the very able personage of Adrian Pickley to have a look further into how we can make sure that because you are educationally disadvantaged, it doesn't flow into your education generally. I believe very fervently that we can help those, particularly those who are in the socio-economic areas of disadvantage, those who are in remote Australia or regional Australia, the Indigenous people, and for that matter, those who don't have English as their first language. They must be helped. They're intelligent, and we want them to have a wonderful life and the benefits of great education. I look forward, as I said, to hearing of the outcome of tonight. I wish you all well, and particularly those of you who are educators. You're doing wonderful work, and I compliment you. I also thank those who are with us tonight, who are our donors and our alumni, and generally to all of you. Education, for me, is the most important thing we can do for our young and indeed our community as a whole. And I look forward very much to seeing whether in fact education and equality is in fact unfinished business.
So, on that great start, it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Davison. Chris is a professor of education and the head of the UNSW School of Education. She's a specialist in English language education and school-based assessment, with a particular focus on the education of disadvantaged students. She's the immediate past president of the New South Wales Council of Deans of Education and the deputy director of the UNSW Gonski Institute for Education. So Chris will set the stage and introduce our facilitator.
Why are we all here tonight? What is this unfinished business? Australia has a high reputation nationally and internationally for its educational system, deservedly so. However, the Gonski report identified unacceptable trends in the educational outcomes of Australian school students, including a significant link between low levels of academic achievement and educational disadvantage. Although there has been a lot of talk and some action, there is still a lot to do. The academic underperformance and poor student wellbeing outcomes are most apparent amongst students with Indigenous backgrounds, with long-standing and significant gaps in not just performance but in attention, attendance and retention and wellbeing in education that seems to get worse, not better, as we move up the school. Students with disabilities are also doing it tough, often not having full access to the high-quality education they deserve. Girls are not able to leverage their rising educational achievement into careers in STEM and other areas at the rate our economy needs. And the impressive figures on student mobility and educational achievement amongst girls and boys from language backgrounds other than English disguises a huge variability in performance among such students, depending on visa category, previous schooling, and language and cultural background. Also still marginalised are students from low socioeconomic backgrounds and many, too many, from rural and remote areas. NAPLAN and PISA results show these trends dramatically, but also identify the equally disturbing decline in the result of our top 20% of students, high-performing students, the tall poppies in Australia that are also not getting the attention and education that they need. This is indeed unfinished business, and we look forward to some creative and innovative solutions from our panel tonight. I would like now, with my great pleasure, to introduce Alexandria Smith, the education editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, who will be facilitating this evening's panel. Alexandria has been a Fairfax journalist for 18 years, as well as being a columnist and political reporter. She has covered education for The Guardian in London and won a Walkley Award for her coverage of plagiarism in Australian universities. She is author of the book, If You Want to Blitz Your Year 12 Exams, Read This Book, which will be released in December. Please welcome Alexandria.
Wish I was available 20 years ago.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome to what is sure to be a lively debate. We have a wonderful array of questions that have been sent in from the audience. Thank you very much. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. It's my pleasure now to introduce the panel. Their details can be seen on the screen behind me, but I will just go through in a little more detail and tell you who they are. Lila Malarchik. Lila is the Director of Secondary Education in the New South Wales Department of Education. Lila was Principal of Marylands High for 15 years, as well as a classroom teacher for more than a decade. Earlier this year, Lila was honoured with the Order of Australia Medal for her commitment to education. Jihad Dib. Jihad is the Shadow Minister for Education and the member for Lakemba. He is the state's first lower house Muslim MP. And before he was elected to Parliament in 2015, Jihad was Principal of Punchbowl Boys. When he took the job at just 33, the school was facing closure. Jihad turned that school around. Professor Mary O'Kane. Mary is the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer. Mary has achieved an incredible amount in the areas of science and engineering. She's the chair of several boards and was Vice-Chancellor and Rector of the University of Adelaide from 1996 to 2001 and is an Honorary Fellow of Engineers Australia. Adrian Piccoli. Adrian is Professor of Practice at the UNSW School of Education. Adrian was an MP in State Parliament for 18 years and Education Minister for 6. During those 6 years, he implemented several key policies and was a champion of the Gonski school funding reforms. This is Adrian's first public appearance in his new role as Director of the Gonski Institute of Education.
Don't stuff it. It's a world premiere.
Just to set the scene, I'm going to ask each panellist a question before we take questions from the audience. Lilla, you have extensive experience in high school classrooms in some very challenging schools. Has there been a defining moment in your career that really highlights the issue of equality for you?
Absolutely. There are several highlights in my career, but one story that I would like to share with everyone, and it's from my last school that was low SES, 74% non-English speaking background, 16% refugees, 14% Aboriginal students. Results were not overwhelming in terms of benchmark results. And it was around about the time, and this story does go back a bit, but it's about equality of voice and empowering and accessing education. So it goes back to near the time of the Cronulla riots. And that was an absolutely huge and debilitating impact on our school community, and we had some students involved in the altercations that were happening there. And it was causing a lot of tension in the schoolyard, and it was becoming quite difficult. And the principal and teachers and year advisors and counsellors were trying to break the nexus of that volatility that was happening, and we weren't getting anywhere. And it got to a point where there was an altercation in the yard, and it was quite vicious and emotionally quite draining for the whole school. And it then erupted into racist issues that we needed to address pretty quickly. And we weren't doing it as adults in the school. And this is where the equality or the access to education came. 2 young men, student leaders in the school, Sef and Siosi, one was Lebanese and one was Tongan, came to me and said, "Miss, Marylands High School is our second home. We can't have this trouble happening here." And they said to me, "We want to run some programs." And as I'm just going to read from this book, and one of the authors is in the audience, but the case study is in here, and it's about Sef, a Lebanese Australian, Siosi, a Tongan Australian, decided that enough was enough at the school. Marylands is our second family, we don't want trouble here. And they gathered other groups of students from within that leadership. Now, I'm just going to say this as I look at Adrian. None of these beautiful leaders who were accessing what was possible would pass the HSC minimum standards. And that's part of the equity issue that needs to be discussed at a later point, but they wouldn't. And they came and they said, "We want to run assemblies, we want to break the nexus of what's happening." And they said that to the principal, and they also said, "We don't want any teachers there." To quote, Principal Mlarchuk was very anxious, but despite her serious misgivings, she gave permission for this to go ahead. And we spoke at length about how we could structure this, and I don't want to go into all of that, but the importance was that these leaders who weren't going to get benchmark results were getting benchmark results as human beings and leaders. They ran 3 assemblies. I wouldn't let them do one. They didn't want teachers there, so we negotiated that we could have the ARCO, that's the anti-racism officer in the back. They ran assemblies that included getting the people who initially were combative in the playground, getting them to get up, talk about why they did it, why the conflict was there, was it racist? No, it wasn't, so we worked through that. They then started to speak to the groups about why are we sitting culturally, because then the divide was even in the audience. They got people to get up, to talk, to hug, to apologise. These students were running this, and they were coming from pretty tough backgrounds. And it went on, and then they started to speak about goal setting, speaking about the stereotyping that this was selling to the public if they were going to continue, and it went on. And they did that 3 times. They gave permission
to our student body from there on in to be part of the leadership platform in that school community, not only just the school, but the school community. And whilst we said that no teacher was allowed to be in there, that was part of the deal, we had a young casual teacher walk out crying. We didn't realise that she was in there because she looked really young. She was up the back and she didn't realise that she was not meant to be there, but she walked out crying because she had never seen the power, the power of those students. That was an equal opportunity of conditions for those students. And they still come back and visit the school and so forth. But I wanted to do the spirit of what is possible for any child in any school, as long as we can platform that equal access to education, to leadership and learning. Thanks.
Oh, wow.
I was fortunate. I'll get over it. Yes,
Thanks,
that's
Lilla.
just one.
Jihad, I'd like to go to you now. I know you've spoken a lot about pressure, particularly around the new HSC minimum standards. Do we put our students under too much pressure? And Adrian, I know you may like to comment on this as well.
I'll say at the outset, Adrian and I get on very well, and we agree on most things. This one was, we had some really interesting discussions about this. I think what Lilla had just shared is that absolute transformative power of education. And I know that there was no way having a dig or anything, but I thought that the point about those kids maybe might not have met a standard that had been set as an arbitrary benchmark. And the questions for me will always be, how do we actually measure success in schools? How do we measure what is an excellent outcome? Is it that we want kids to be trained to be robotic, to rote learn, or do we actually want kids who have got some other things that will make them great citizens, including the fact that, I want kids to have a bit of compassion, to have an understanding, to have a sense of not only self-worth, but also a sense of contribution. The one thing that we do agree on is there needs to be some sort of a minimum standard. There has to be. Where the disagreement really comes in is I don't believe that what was said as the HSC minimum standards, a Band-Aid NAPLAN, is the way to go. So I think we sort of disagreed a lot on the mechanism. I think, and I've publicly said a number of times, we're not against, and I'm certainly not against the minimum standard. What I'm against is an arbitrary line that's been drawn up. And the reason that I say that is because a teenager goes through enough pressures as it is. Now, we need to go back a few steps and ask, why is a kid getting to year 9 and he's still so far behind? Do we start looking further back? Do we start looking at what we're doing in the earlier? Do we look at what's happening before they get to school? Because we know that the opportunities are there. If we can get young people up on the best start, then the trajectory is going to grow at a much faster level further down the track. There's also a lot more complications, and many of you would work in schools or of school environments, that nothing is just ever black and white. The kid who was at Lilla's school is completely different to a kid who's at another person's school. Sometimes people come to the school gate and you don't know what they've brought with them that morning. You don't know whether you're the first person to actually say good morning to them. I think we all agree on that. And so that's not then reason to say, well, we're not going to extend them. The best teachers that I ever worked with are the ones that actually had a very high benchmark. They expected things from kids. They had a high standard. But what they did is they supported them. And I think that's what I keep talking about. What I worry about, and I mentioned this in an earlier discussion, is whilst it's really good that maybe kids who are in year 8 or year 7 are willing to give up their holidays because teachers are very kindly giving them time to be able to do some study, I actually want them to be a kid as well. And it's something that we've spoken about, that there's a lot of things. Life, there's a long time, hopefully, to live your life. I just think that the pressures that we end up putting on kids, if we go just specifically with this academic pressure, then potentially what we're doing is we're saying that you're only a success if you achieve this certain benchmark. And that's the mechanism that I worry about. But in terms of minimum standard, I think it's important. But we need to, as a whole system, have a look at what it is that we expect of students, what it is that we want students to graduate with when they finish year 12, not only in terms of their academic excellence, but also in terms of their personal excellence as well.
Adrian, perhaps I'll ask you this next then. I'd like your thoughts on measuring the performance of a school and a school system. Do we put too much focus on NAPLAN and PISA?
We do, and my issue with both of those, but particularly NAPLAN's always been about how you use the data. So when, about 2010, when New South Wales agreed to provide NAPLAN data to the Commonwealth and therefore for it to be published I, amongst others, were one of the leaders of the opposition to that because of the misuse of that data. But I mean, I'm a parent. My son's just finished or did Year 3 NAPLAN this year. Got to say, I found the information very useful to see how he was performing individually compared to his class and compared to the state. And I mean, I ground-proofed it, as all parents should do, with his teachers to say, is this actually, it's a snapshot, is it actually an accurate reflection of how he's going at school? And they said, yes, it was. So I had confidence to know then where my own child was across the state. I mean, you can be in a school and your kid can be the top in the maths, in his maths or her maths class, but compared to the rest of the state, it can be quite low. So I do think it provides useful information. It's not the only source of information. Schools do assessments, maybe not every day, but every week. And it should be part of the mix, and schools use information appropriately. It's how media and others, and how even parents choose their school in a very superficial way. I think that is destructive and negative, particularly around this issue of equity. You then tend to have higher performing students going to schools that are deemed to be high performance schools, when that's not necessarily true. I mean, I know in my community that I live in, some of the best teachers in our community actually go to the school with the most reds and the fewest greens on the NAPLAN, on the My School website. So, I don't think it aids the issue of equity, because parents make the wrong decisions about schools if they just base it on NAPLAN data. And on pressure, why we did the Band 8 thing, we have this issue in Australia where our performance improves up to Year 6, Year 7, then it starts to dip in middle high school, and then once kids start to take school seriously with Year 12, it improves. How do we deal with that dip in engagement? I don't think it's a dip in teacher performance, it's a dip in engagement. And one of the policy measures was to actually make Year 9 NAPLAN, set a standard. The Year 9 NAPLAN is the first opportunity to get to meet that standard. And I've got to say, in the first year we've seen big growth. In the two public high schools in Griffith where I live, 12 kids out of 190 last year met that minimum standard. This year it was 50. 50 is still way below the state average, but 12 was completely unacceptable. And a big improvement. And most of that's because the kids are taking the test more seriously. But I don't think we do have a lot of pressure in Australian schools. We have pressure in Year 12. A lot of that pressure comes from students who are unprepared, who can't write essays, and think they're going to do it all in Year 11 and 12. And if we want to perform like, and this is a big if, we want to perform like other countries like Singapore, Canada, South Korea, the ones we always get compared to every time NAPLAN and PISA results come out, you should see the pressure there. That's what you call pressure. I don't think as a country we want to go down that path. Yeah. But, high performance does mean pressure. A little bit of pressure for everybody. Government, schools, students and parents.
Maybe I think it's sort of where that idea, having the pressure, you need to have some pressure, but I think it's finding that fine line between the pressure and then the situation where kids will end up getting to a position where they end up self-harming or things like that. And that's the thing that worries me. So, and that's not true for all cases, but I'm certainly in agreement that there needs to be pressure, there needs to be application, but it's finding that right balance. And I suppose that's the challenge for all of us.
And Mary, just to you, I know you've spoken often and passionately about the importance of maths. How can we make students, particularly female students, more interested in maths?
I think a lot of it is confidence in teachers. I think if you have a teacher who really loves maths and is confident in their knowledge of what they're teaching, I think that often is what it is. And I agree with Jihad about the importance of standards, expecting high performance, but actually also pulling it through by showing that it's doable, that maths is, after all, in a formal sense, just another language, and showing that it can be done, but and you can build on what you've learned, and it builds up. Now, maths is a wonderful discipline in the sense that it aggregates from a set of axioms and comes through to a series of wonderful proofs and so on. And giving people the confidence, basically, to reason with symbols is a tremendous skill. And I think if you let them see they can do it, I think they'll actually love it and want to go on. But it does require a teacher who is inspiring.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to now go to some audience questions. And the first one of the evening is from Chris Bonner from the Centre for Policy Development.
Can I break the rule and stand up?
Of course.
No.
I'll sit down now. Look, the school sectors increasingly receive similar levels of public funding over the last few years especially, yet government schools enrol most disadvantaged students and further increasing inequality. So the question is, what would you do to ensure that the task of lifting our strugglers falls more evenly across all schools and all school sectors?
Lila, I was going to go to you on this one.
And I'd like to thank Chris Bonner for that question. Well, I mean, my first response is, let's reduce the number of strugglers. And the only way we can do that is by adequately resourcing schools to support the learning needs and the learning enrichment of students there. But we also need to ensure that all schools that accept public funding take local enrolments. That they look at using the public funding for the public. This needs to be inclusive, not exclusive. And we need to work on the platform that if you exclude, you lose. You don't get that public funding. Now, I'm quite proudly going to sit here and say that I believe the public education system works to meet the needs of all learners and all types of learners and all comers. And that's really important. But still, inequality exists between the sectors and quite honestly within the sectors as well. So that's another aspect of this whole discourse that we need to be looking at. So what is it that we can do? Well, apart from one of the obvious, which is absolutely funding adequately all schools to meet the needs of the students in their schools, and to fund schools that work on the societal, the cultural and the binding values, I guess, of our society, to fund them because they're all takers. So we adequately support and resource schools. And I may just reference Gonski version 1. I cannot understand any discourse or argument not to have that and to change that package. And thank you, Adrian, for all your work in terms of fighting for that on behalf of New South Wales. And I actually think he should be applauded for that because it was pretty courageous stuff. We would, I guess, encourage all political parties that when you give money to schools like that, and it's not so much saying that you're accountable for using it, but you're accountable for the expenditure. Let's look at that end of it rather than the planning and the programs to see that we get it. What about systems that embrace all sectors? So if we look at the New Zealand model, 95% of schools are within one system, and that does include sectors, different sectors, but they come under the one branch. There's another way not to have residualised schools or sectors or school communities. And once again, I'll go back to Gonski version 1. There are different ways of looking at the system as well. What sorts of things can we do more broadly across our schools and across the framework to support? And we start to look at increasing school counselling, increasing resources that you can use across communities of schools. And there are different frameworks that have been looked at. We're looking at the connected communities, for example. There's one. Hubs of schools, how that works to support across. So you're getting maximum capacity. Increasing leadership capacity to understand how that can work, not across one school, across a platform of schools. And I can keep going if you would like me to. I certainly, because it's quite an amazing discussion that we could have, but I think the underlying principles remain that it is about every child, and every child. Jihad and I have been in, Jihad not as long as I have, but we've been in schools for several decades, and there has never been a child that doesn't deserve the best education that we can provide. And we've done that across other sectoral schools as well. But we need to resource adequately and fairly, because the entitlement is there for every child, which includes your child, the child down the street, the family that does have a choice of which schools they go to, or the family that doesn't have a choice of which school they go to.
Can I just add to that and say it's a really difficult thing, because even within public education, people drive right past one or two public schools to go to another one. I mean, the only way to avoid that is a rigid zoning system where you're only one sector and everyone's got to go to this. But then at the same time, when you do that, you'll then get an area of public housing where all the public housing students have to go to the same school. And I don't know that that's the ideal solution either. Parents do choose schools often based on the peers that they want their kids to hang out with. That's just the reality of it within the public system and then across the three sectors. And that's just that's just the reality of the system that we've got in. But Lila's right. It doesn't matter what school you go to. This was the great beauty of Gonski, that there is enough resource there for every single student. And we've got concentrations of disadvantage. That disadvantage is magnified. Therefore, the resources have to be magnified as well.
Can I just ask, in New South Wales, unlike other states, we have a high concentration of selective schools. Does that not help the equity issue?
No, it doesn't. And they're very high SES schools. They're higher SES schools than most of the independent schools that are seen as, certainly the expensive independent schools. So it's a high SES choice. I mean, it's selective, academically selective, but it's a choice made by high SES parents with gifted children.
We'll take another question from the audience now. Dr. Layla Morsey from the UNSW School of Education.
So, the main approach to improving student learning and to narrowing the achievement gap between groups of students is to implement school-based solutions. So that's usually increasing school and teacher accountability for student results, for example. However, 2/3 of the variation in student performance is attributable to non-school factors, including children's health and family factors. These factors, as Adrian started to mention, cause large differences in academic achievement between groups of students. For example, from high-income versus low-income families or Indigenous versus non-Indigenous students. So how can practice, policy, and research, as well as the media, contribute to addressing the largely neglected non-school factors that impact student achievement?
Jihad, I might go to you on this one.
Good question. And I think certainly we've touched on it in so many different ways. Look, I mean, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to schools, and every single school is different. You can have two schools basically within a kilometre of each other, and they are completely different. In some cases, you definitely want a mix of a school. You want a real range of kids. You don't want kids, ideally, who are all exactly the same in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of, because it's then all the same. And I don't think it's a true reflection of society. One of the things that Adrian and I just recently wrote was that there's a lot of kids who actually turn up to school without breakfast. Kids who turn up to school and said, and I used to use this a lot in my own school, say, you might be the only person who says hello to them or good morning to them. You might actually be the person who asks how they're going. At this point in time, I know of a 14-year-old kid who's at home looking after her mother who is terminally ill. Now, when that child goes to school, what they need is for the school to be there for them, regardless of what they need. They need someone to understand. Lila talked about the family. You'll hear lots of talk about school family. School families are really important, and because in many cases, it's the one constant in someone's life. And if you can go somewhere where it's always the same, you know what's going to be expected, you know that people are looking after you, then I think that's a really important thing. It then comes back to the money. The money isn't everything, but the money helps a lot. We had one issue. I managed to get, and I was really, really happy with this. It may not seem like an important thing, but you talk about the difference that small things can make. We had an issue. Trying to get kids into school uniform was really big. It was a really important thing because there was a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. And we'd go to the black shoes. And there was one time when a young boy came to the school, and we'd stand at the gate, myself and the deputy principals, every morning. We'd do the hello and the salutations, but really we were also doing a uniform check at the same time. But they didn't know that. And there was this one young man, I think he was year 9, year 10, and he wasn't wearing his correct shoes, and I asked him where his shoes were, and he said, my brother's borrowing because he's got caught today. And that hits you like an absolute ton of bricks. This kid's going to walk into the classroom. He might run into a teacher who's having a go at him because he didn't bring a pen, or, you don't know what's happening outside. So that understanding is really important, levelling the playing field where we can, but also making sure that, I think certainly from a school perspective, ensuring that all of the teachers who work in the school have actually an understanding of the community that they're working in. Teachers do it because there's a real passion, there's a desire to do the right thing, but understanding the community. My experience is that students who are disadvantaged don't want you to tell them that they're disadvantaged. They just want you to help them out. They don't want you to make a special example of them and to make them different to anybody else. They just want you to understand where they're coming from, and they're going to do their very best. And from a policy perspective, I'll give you a really good example. Schools can be used for community purposes, but you try and use a school for community purposes. Sometimes it's really difficult. And if you're a little community organisation or a little community group, and you want to have, say, a little meeting, you want to have a church group or a little dance group or something like that, if that principal won't lend you the school, then you've got nowhere else to go. So I talk a great deal about schools as community hubs, and that's a really important thing, because what that does is it creates a sense of belonging for the community, a sense of ownership for the community, but also within the school then it becomes part of the community, so that you can try as much as you can to avoid that situation that Adrian mentioned, where kids will walk straight past one school on their way to another within the same sector. So it needs a lot of different things, but ultimately it's also that mindset and understanding that nothing is exactly the same wherever you go. But if you approach it with that idea that the kid is always at the very centre, and your teachers also believe that, and that's what they understand, and everybody in the school community believes that, then we go a long way to addressing it and making this really, really clear. And I'll finish on this one. We may inadvertently patronise kids by saying, oh, you poor thing, that's not what we do. And we can't do that. What we need to do is to give every child an opportunity to take a child to the theatre who's never been to the theatre. Some kids, just to go on a bridge on a train across the Harbour Bridge, down to the Opera House, down a Circular Quay, we might take that for granted, but that is a whole new experience and creates a sense of belonging. So schools, absolute centre of the community, and we've got to do a lot more in terms of schools as community hubs, changing that mindset. The community owns the school. It isn't one person's individual school.
Did you, Mary?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment. It's a very obvious comment, but on the non-school factors like health, I think we can do a lot more about alerting parents and students themselves, even quite small kids. If you have a problem with your hearing, if you have a problem with your sight, you can go backwards so fast, particularly, we see it in Indigenous communities, particularly on sight and hearing, have been really big factors in holding kids back in education. So making sure parents are aware of just how detrimental that is. And a child themselves, if you think you're having problems seeing, if you can't hear the teacher, that there's nothing wrong with actually going and talking about it and having some route out with that. I know we've done a lot in that area nationally, but I think there's more to do to alert people who are or having trouble. Often we don't spot dyslexia until a long way in. But there are sort of simple tests you can tell people themselves to look for, and if they, accidentally alert, that doesn't matter. But if we do capture it a lot earlier, we can do a lot better.
So, if you don't mind, I just wanted to add something to what Jihad was saying, but I'll just make a couple of comments that the interagency model is something that is absolutely a necessity for most school communities, and I won't go into that because I want to get to a uniform issue. And the second thing is that in schools we can most influence the in-school factors, and that's where we really need to concentrate what we're doing. But I want to take up on something that Jihad said about uniform, because we were at similar schools and I didn't actually ever feel that I was going to be someone who monitored uniform, but I did turn into that principal. And it was...
Oh, they're the best type.
I know. But just to explain why, 2 comments from students. Our students, I've said, you know, the demographics and the type of school. I did invest in lots of blazers and ties, so when they were going to excursions that they would wear it. We actually got to the point where they would come and ask, and, you know, I left the school with 400 blazers, so there were lots of activity. But the comment that got me to invest in that was a group of students who were at the art gallery. They came back and said, "Miss, we looked like the other schools. We felt like the other schools." That nailed it for me. Uniform is just symbolic of that equality and accessing of education.
Can I say one other thing too? I mean, nobody blames the doctor in Brewarrina because there are high incidence of diabetes, right? But you ask what's wrong with education, and it's all the school. So schools do get treated differently to any other profession. But the second thing is parental as an out of school factor. Parental expectations is a big one. And we know in regional New South Wales, even the parents of high-performing students have a much lower expectation that their children will go on to higher education. The access issues for a variety of reasons, and that's one of the reasons why performance in rural and remote is lower. But again, one of the things about setting a standard and, you know, differences of opinion what it should be with respect to NAPLAN is also actually about setting an expectation for parents to set for their children. You know, in these Southeast Asian countries that are blitzing, their expectations of their children are very high. I think part of the problem, and just talking to even my friends, they're not even sure what should be their academic expectations of their own children. I mean, you ask somebody in Year 5 what NAPLAN result would be proficient level, and most people can't tell you. So part of even the Year 9 thing is actually about saying to parents, actually, here's the expectation of where your children should be performing. And I love talking to parents about it because I say, if you don't think Band 8's high enough, then is Band 7 okay? Because you can get that in Year 3. And the parents go, oh. You know. Alex and I don't agree.
Can I just add, sorry, just one thing that worked really well for us, isn't it? So one thing that worked really well for us, and come back to the schools as community hubs thing, was actually we did, and Adrian made me think about them, like a parenting course. And it wasn't in that patronising parenting, it was sometimes as simple as, you know, we used to have kids who would go down and buy a can of V in the morning, and it was the same price as buying an orange juice. And having to kind of like say, this is why it's not as good, but also just having a way that you could help parents. And we had obviously a number of parents from non-English speaking backgrounds, and for them, the school experience may have been limited as well. So it's opening up those doors, and it's all that interagency thing. But the school itself, almost like a spoke model where the school becomes the hub of the community, and that's a really important one, so that you can have those discussions with parents. Because if you build a really good relationship with people, it's so much easier to have a conversation. If the only time you're talking to your school community is when there's a problem, well, how can you actually ask them to support you when they don't actually know you other than in the bad times?
We might now go to Alexandra Clark, a current Bachelor of Education student at UNSW.
I'd like to know whether it is actually possible to achieve true equity and equal opportunity for our students in a society that relies so heavily on the private education sector, particularly while our government continues to fund these schools, some with exorbitant fees. How is it anywhere near impossible for our small public schools to compete by providing the same kinds of opportunities to their students?
Go on.
Lila, I know you've touched on this.
I thought it was
But another opportunity for you.
Up front about what I was saying. Well, look, let's go to the public education sector. Educates the vast majority of students, but also the vast majority of disenfranchised and disadvantaged students. So I am going to go back over the grounds, and I don't know that I'm going to speak about it as Gonski funding. What about if I call it fair, evidence-based appropriate resourcing and an entitlement for all, not just for some. So I might just refer to it that way, because that's what resourcing is all about for our children, each and every one of them. And I'm not just speaking about those that need an equitable platform to come in, but we also need to be speaking about extension for students as well. So it's the whole gamut of what needs to be there. And we can't be maintaining, I guess, the funding for high fee schools that exclude the majority of the community or the groups that surround them or anyone accessing. This can't be an ongoing, sustainable, equitable, equal approach to education, and I was hinting, or not hinting, I alluded to a number of different countries that have a different approach where they do more broadly embrace all the schools. People are going to say to me that people deserve choice of schools, but I've said it before and we all agree there are only some families that have access to choice, not all. And why can't we be providing, as we need to, for every child in every situation? And it goes back to Adrian's comment about concentration of disadvantage. You can break the nexus of equitable outcomes and doing that. And if I could just go back to Gonski funding, and I'm sure GHAD can do this as well, a whole host of programs that we put in play at Marylands High School as an example, where the nexus started to be broken, but we need it to be sustainable and to know about certainty. And I'm going to say things now. Within 2 years, we trebled the university offerings, and take that separately, acceptances, because they're two different things, from our Year 12 students. How did we do that? We had paraprofessionals that could work with students. What's the aspect that we used there? We actually had ex-students as aspirant models for our students to see that there was a pathway. Jihad spoke about parents. We would bus our parents to universities. I'm not saying university is the only option, but that was an aspiration that wasn't within the community. We bused them to universities so that they could see that it wasn't a frightening, unknown place. And if you take it to another aspect, culturally, around some of the daughters, there was a fear of letting your daughter go to an unknown city, which is a university. So we had those sort of things happening. We had a 14% increase in submission of assessment tasks within 2 years. We had a 5% trend data increase in attendance over 3 years. You've got to have them at school to teach them. So those sorts of things were starting to get those students, those human beings, those children on a platform that was rising. I didn't say it was equal, but it was rising, so the opportunity was there.
I've got a question from Associate Professor Kathy Sherry from UNSW Faculty of Law. Unfortunately, Kathy couldn't be here tonight, but her question is, one of the greatest inequities in education is private tutoring. It's highly effective in the New South Wales HSC and only accessible by families with means. What can the education system do to minimise the impact of private tutoring? Jihad?
So another thing that I've spoken about a little bit, I think, and it comes down to the issue of equity, not only is it about people who can afford it, there's also a number of people who are having to work, families who are doing it tough, who actually work in additional jobs, whether it's a night shift, whether someone's driving a cab, whether it's someone working, cleaning, whatever they can do to save money so they can send their child to tutoring. There's something called pre-uni now. And I just thought pre-uni was for Year 12, but it actually isn't. Pre-uni actually starts before kindy. Now, this is the reality. I'm seeing kids who are being pulled out of sport on a Saturday and going to tutoring schools. It's actually become, if you're actually not doing tutoring now, you're kind of like almost the odd ones out. And I think a little bit of that goes back to the pressure, a little bit of that expectation. Things are happening in schools. If I go back to that very first step, if we can get some of our early ed a bit better, it'll make a difference, because not everybody goes to school, at the same starting point. This is, again, things that Adrian and I completely agree on. So let's try and get everybody up to the starting point. But I think we as a society need to have a look at what it is that we're saying we accept. The additional pressure that we put on is there all the time, is because we say, you have to get this. I'm really happy to see now that universities are looking at ways other than just ATAR to get students to enrol. There's lots of different opportunities. A young student in year 11 or 12 may not achieve their best educational outcome then, but maybe a little bridging course gives them that chance either to mature or to get themselves together, to improve their language skills. I think there's a time and there's a place for a bit of additional work, and whether it's tutoring, but what I'm really becoming worried about is it's now becoming almost the norm. It's like after school, it's tutoring, and it is a massive business. It's a huge business, and sometimes, look, I'll talk about myself. My daughter's doing her year 12 next year, so she's just started year 12, and she's struggling with, I think it's economics that she's struggling with. It's economics, I think. one of those. I'm only interested in the English bit. I can only help her with the English and society and culture. But anyway, so she's going to go to some tutoring thing. And I asked her the other day, how did it go? She said, oh, Dad, it was all right, but I was in a class with 8 other people. I said, oh, okay. How much did it cost? It was $60. Now, I thought, wow, that's a bit of money to be spent. It's not like one-on-one tutoring. What can schools do? Schools are doing a lot more, which is really fantastic. And one of the programs that we did with the universities is they're actually sending undergrad students to assist kids who can't afford it. Because again, what we're doing is we're creating further inequity. If it's about the ones who can't afford it, can't do the tutoring, so they're missing out, or the ones who can't afford it, mum and dad, or mum or dad by themselves are actually going without to pay for tutoring, then we're actually creating other forms of inequity. But that's a really good one. There is no shortage of teachers who volunteer their time. Lots of schools offer homework clubs. The teachers are amazing people. The amount of volunteering they do, the amount of free time they give is enormous. And that's part and parcel. It shouldn't be an expectation, but they do it. But I do worry about the increase, almost in expectation that people do go to tutoring, and also completely unregulated. How are you to know as a parent whether this person is actually a decent tutor? And it worries me when, no offence to second-year university students, charging, like a wounded bull. What actual teaching experience do they have? Because all it is just more rote learning. And the final one that I've got as a major concern, things like study guides, like your NAPLAN study book, the top-selling children's book in Australia. That should not be the top-selling children's book in Australia.
I think they're fine.
But I want to know how to blitz my HSC. I would buy that one. But I think it sort of says a bit about us. Really important. Again, all these expectations, really important to have it, but at what cost and who gets left out? I think it's really wrong when parents are working additional jobs just so they can get their kid to do more and put pressure on them. Schools do a fantastic job, but of course, everybody needs some assistance. And when we talk about needs-based funding, how about needs-based funding that can be used to actually pay for tutors to come to school and they can help with assistance afterwards?
Mary?
I want to make a comment on the tutoring issue, which worries me a lot. Partly the unregulated bit, which I'll come to in a minute. But I think one of our biggest problems is that in many areas, and maths and some of the science areas in particular, we have a linear model of education, that you have to do this well and then the next year you have to do that year, and if you miss some point you can never get back, or you can never get back in minimum time. And there are plenty of counter models to that, and I think the universities need to step up a lot more, and this has been a campaign I've been on for over 30 years since I was first a Dean of Engineering, that there have been models where you can start maths at university. You don't have to have done it at school. You have to have a certain degree of symbolic reasoning aptitude, which can be tested for. But the universities need to allow you to start again, or maybe we need to do that in school. And so it needs to be a partnership between the different parts of the education system. And I think we need to model it a lot more, because it also helps with an awful lot of other equity issues. The kids from country schools where there wasn't a proper maths teacher, the physics wasn't offered, there certainly was Mandarin Chinese or whatever it is, then, if you can start when you get to university or when you get to TAFE, there is it takes a lot of that pressure off that often goes with tutoring. On the regulatory issue, I always encourage people to take that into their own hands, particularly, and to rate people and do it online. And so to start a rating scheme, don't just do it with tutoring, do it with knee surgeons, do it with everybody.
Uber tutoring.
You know, 5 stars, 2 stars, and that.
There's a really interesting business model set up, and so people see this as a business opportunity. They've got no educational background, they've got no educational training, but they actually set up effectively an after-hours school. That's part of the thing that also worries me, that it's seen through the prism of a business model, not through the prism of an educational model.
We might now go to the issue of access. Kalita Murray from the Matraville Soldiers Settlement Public School has a question about closing the gap.
Despite many years of effort and millions of dollars, closing the gap doesn't seem to be making much progress with regards to education. Why do you think this is, and what should schools and the government be doing to truly support Aboriginal students?
I think, Adrian, that's one for you.
Well, look, I was Minister for Education 6 years, and I said in my last speech the thing that we didn't do well enough is in Aboriginal education. And we did things, but we didn't do enough. We didn't close the gap sufficiently. I think there's a slight closing, but if that's certainly my number one regret in my period as Minister for Education. We tried very targeted things around things like connected communities. We took 15 schools essentially out of the system and treated them differently, and most highly paid principals, try and get the best leaders in place. We went in and we actually managed some of the staff out of those schools to make sure we had the right staff. We tried to hire as many Aboriginal staff as possible. We did a number of other things. I mean, the funding model itself there's a strong bias towards supporting Aboriginal students, doesn't matter which school they go to. Part of it is trying to get more Aboriginal teachers into the teaching workforce. That's working to a degree, but it certainly needs to work better. I know in remote communities we'd love to see a lot more local Aboriginal people from country coming back to country as teachers. Saw a great example in Alberta, where something like 85% of the staff in one community were local First Nations people come back to teach at that school. The principal had a PhD in education something or other, and the results had actually absolutely gone through the roof. So, yeah, it's not an easy solution. If it was, it would have been resolved a long time ago. But as I said, it's one of my regrets as Minister for Education, and in my new role, what I love so much about this new role is hopefully I get to have another go at doing a better job of it. The professional development of staff and the Connecting to Country professional development a lot of the staff have done have been really good, and I've made the comment in Parliament too that we are the department, others have been addressing some significant oversights for a long time. I mean, the physical condition of the schools at Walgett and at Moree East, both almost exclusively, almost 100% enrolment of Aboriginal students, the two probably worst schools I've ever seen, and would never happen in Sydney, that's for sure, because people would never let it happen.
I might just add just a bit to this, and I think and I want to acknowledge Adrian's work. I mean, it's sometimes we have to go toe to toe, so to speak, but you certainly did the best, and it's a difficult job, and you give credit where it's due. I think this goes back a little bit to Auntie Barbara, to that idea of, again, schools as community hubs, and again, I would just keep saying it over and over again. The more that the teachers and the school and the community, and I'm talking about the entire community, I'm talking about the local businesses, the local community organisations, the local police, the local SES, that is what a community is. The more that they actually interact with one another, the better it is, so that when something happens within the community, if there's a time of mourning, everybody mourns, everybody understands. And that's a really important thing that we do. I had the pleasure of visiting a couple of schools that really stand out to me. Menindee Central School was fantastic, and I think it was Kerry. I'm not 100% sure. It may have been Kerry is the principal there, but was an ex-Menindee, kid, and come back, and you should have seen the esteem that she was held in. And the other one I was really impressed with Nathan Towney out at Newcastle as a principal. And a few different schools that I've visited now, they've tried to incorporate where they can, particularly with our First Peoples, things that they're comfortable with, but also trying to be able to teach that. So the thing that really impressed me at Nathan's was his yarning circle, and I've seen that in a few different things. And he said, Jahad, this is part of the Indigenous culture that we want everybody to understand. And they've got like the different community leaders who come into the school. So it's not also just about the sport, but I would agree with Adrian, and hopefully one day I'll get the chance to be the minister. And one of the big things that I really want to... No, 2019. But the thing being, how do we make sure that we've got teachers of so many different backgrounds who can assist? And I think, because it's not about having, say, an Indigenous teacher says, hey, look at me, I'm better than you. But that kid who's in the school actually sees himself in that teacher. And I think once you see yourself in a position, then you can really become anything that you want. It breaks down all the barriers. And
it's not all, it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, the Matraville results, Chris was telling me at the high school going really well. Dubbo College the other day on the ABC, for those who saw it, 60 graduating, or 60 Aboriginal students doing year 12, some good things happening in some improvements in places like Walgett. There's a few things, but we need to have that to be happening in a lot more places, I guess, is the challenge.
We might move now to gender in education. Dr. Margaret Varadi from the Institute of Digital Education Africa, we have a question from you.
Thank you. Perhaps a question to Professor O'Kane. I've always had a great interest in the imposter syndrome working with girls, and reading Professor Andrew Martin's research recently, he suggested that the imposter syndrome and gender stereotypes may result in girls not taking science subjects. So what do you, from your experiences, how do you suggest that we could deal with this gender inequity in relation to STEM subjects, perhaps at a systems level?
First of all, I think it's not so much about gender, it's about kids generally learning maths at the start. The gatekeeper always is maths. And I think a lot of the issues that go wrong, for some reason, in our society, not in Russian or not in Chinese societies or Finnish, maths is seen as somehow a boys' issue. So I think that starts way back, and I think it's really important also to have brilliant female maths teachers at all sorts of levels. So I think there's again, I agree about seeing yourself in the teacher is tremendously important. The other thing I think is talking, strangely enough, is at the other end of the school career or time, is when kids are looking at going on to higher education of some sort or into a vocation, is to be very realistic about jobs. And so one of the problems I think has been, there's been an awful lot of teaching, it's important to do science so that we get more kids in science jobs, but actually there are very few jobs for scientists, straight jobs. There are laboratory technician jobs which are relatively low status. Whereas actually there are plenty of still quite a range of jobs in medicine and the allied health areas, very good jobs. There are good jobs in the more technical trades, electrical, plumbing and so on. There are good jobs in engineering. But I think often, for some reason, we've shown science as somehow be nice to be in chemistry or biology, but there are no jobs there. So I think in some areas we've spent a lot of time doing things that aren't actually particularly useful, whereas I think attention to enjoying and really loving maths and then other science subjects and having great teachers early on so the grounding's good, and then at the end being realistic about what exists is important.
Anyone else that? I guess then I might ask about students with English as a second language. Jeanette Freeman, President of ATSOL, I think we have a question from you.
When you disaggregate the performance of students from language backgrounds other than English on national and international assessments by main language spoken in the home and visa status, you reveal huge variabilities between subgroups, with some even performing below the level of Indigenous students. At the same time, we appear to be cutting the specialist EALD services to schools. What needs to be done to address this inequity?
Lilla or Jihad, I think that would be good for you.
It's interesting, isn't it? NESB, I think I've done a number of different analyses looking at how different things work. When we've got a population, 40% of the people, either themselves or their parents, are born overseas, a whole heap of us are NESB. But I suppose you also break it down in terms of how recent the arrival has been, how much education they've had in Australia. The mistake that a lot of people make is that they think that just because you can't speak English, you're dumb. That's certainly not the case. You know, it just means you can't speak the language, and it takes a long time. And you see that through some of the outstanding results. And somebody like Dorothy Hoddenott at Holroyd achieves, or other people who work in the intensive English centres. If we can get the English up, then we give them a chance to understand really well. One of the things that I've noticed is happening that I'm a little bit worried about is EALD support that's not only been sort of reduced, but if schools are using the additional funding they have, the needs-based funding, what they're actually doing is not employing specialist EALD teachers. I trained as an English teacher, but I couldn't teach somebody how to read and write English. I needed to be able to teach them from a high school perspective. Somebody who could teach English, in a TESOL form has got a different type of a training. And I think we need to recognise that people are they're specialised, and this is a specialised area, because the quicker we can help somebody improve their English proficiency, the more they can improve. Now, there's a young lady at Beverly Hills Girls High School, which is a school in my electorate, arrived in Australia a couple of years ago, and I've spoken about them in Parliament before. She's got one more exam for her HSC. I saw her father today in Punchbowl, and she hopes to be able to get to university. Now, she couldn't speak English a couple of years ago, and I just think it's such an outstanding achievement that she's doing her HSC, that she's going to get a good result, but she'll be a student who maybe in a couple of years' time will be completely proficient in the language, which will help. But yeah, certainly increase the number of specialist teachers, and keep in mind that it is a specialist. Chris Davison, I did a deal with Chris once. I said, Chris, I'm happy to take 10 of your prac teachers, but I need something from you. I need you to run a course in our school for our teachers of teaching English. What was it? English second language, not English as a second language, but teaching English to second language learners, teaching to second language learners. And that was a terrific thing, because what that did is we had kids in our school who technically don't qualify for ESL support because they'd been here more than 6 years, more than 3 years, but really they still had the same language difficulties. So specialist support, train as many people as you can as an additional thing, and making sure that we put the resources into it, recognising that the language proficiency doesn't correlate to intellectual ability.
I might now move to Melinda Gindi from the Australian Association for the Education of Gifted and Talented.
Good evening.
Hey.
Students who are gifted have an innate natural ability and make up 10% of our student population. According to current research, up to 14% of these students are twice exceptional, gifted with a learning disability. What financial and practical support can we give to our educators so that they can meet the needs of these diverse learners and support them to thrive within our education system?
That's your question,
Lilla?
Well, in terms of twice gifted, hi Melinda, we've done a fair bit of work together. My first statements are going to be around that we need to recognise that they're two separate issues, and we need to ensure that the gifted child who does have a disability, learning or otherwise, that we don't square that out, because they are two separate issues. And as you know, we're working through reviewing the policy around gifted and talented education, and we're looking at gifted education and high potential students. And high performing as well, I should say. And as you know, because we've been in many forums, for instance, Mark Scott has absolutely made some incredibly strong statements about gifted students with a disability, not twice gifted or whatever, around that. So he is absolutely separating those issues, which it should be. And that is going to be embraced as we roll out implementation guidelines, professional learning for teachers, resourcing, a knowledge base and an expertise base. And as we have all wanted, this is for all schools, so that we can identify those issues, those students, and identify how to support each and every one of them.
The worst thing we could do to talk about equity and increasing it, the worst thing we can do is not help a gifted child be able to achieve their full potential, because, you know, whether they're, you know, from an area that's more struggling or they're in a school that it doesn't have it, we've got to find a way that in every single school there's some form of an enrichment stream, and there are teachers who are trained. Again, it's the same. If we have specialised areas, we've got to make sure that we've got specialist teachers in there, but we've also got to make sure that our teachers who are specialised in other curriculum areas have also got the ability to be able to push a child, because I think that will be our failure. As much as we focus on making sure that we bring the kid who's really struggling up, we've also got a moral obligation to make sure that the kid who's already there, we can take them wherever they want to go, because it shouldn't be about where you are, you know, and it shouldn't be, if you can't afford to go to another school, for some reason you want to go to your local comprehensive school, it's got to be able to provide for you.
And it's that identification of the student too, because we don't all realise that someone is a high potential, high performing student. How do we identify that disengaged student who should be under the gifted education framework? That's a really important aspect of this.
Mary?
I'd just like to make a comment about gifted with a disability. I don't think we do enough research generally on some of the big populations of gifted. There are some reasonably frequently occurring combinations in that area, and one I saw a lot in my education career in universities was the dyslexia with high maths potential. And often we saw them particularly in the old CAEs and the universities that had been CAEs, they never got into the sandstones because they didn't make the English requirements often. But often the dyslexia evolves over time so that they can actually be writing quite well and hold down very good jobs in lots of professions. And I think understanding that and be able to help parents, careers counsellors, teachers further back in the school career to give confidence and to celebrate the absolute ability, the hyper ability, as well as support the disability, is something where I'd like to see a lot more psychological and education research.
I'd like to just go now to John Bush from the Paul Ramsay Foundation. John, I'd like your question.
No context for the question, I'll just sort of jump straight in. Does philanthropy have a role to play in educational equity, and if so, what do you think it is?
And I'd like to open that to the panel, to anyone who would like to comment on that.
Well, I don't think philanthropy can be used as an alternative to adequate resourcing. First statement. Second statement, I think that it is it's an opportunity that many community members wish to give back to a school or to a few schools, and I think that's an admirable thing to have that access to that. I think the inequitable approach, so if you are philanthropic and you give a donation to a private school, that's a tax deduction. If you give it to another sector that I may represent, it's a donation without a tax winner to it, and I don't know that that's okay. I also strongly believe that many schools will attract philanthropists, and that then will compound an inequity. So is there some way that we could actually moderate that so that maybe lower SES schools or disadvantaged schools could get access more broadly to that, and that we could be moderating how that was happening. And I mean that across all sectors, not just the one that I'm representing here, but I certainly think that's an aspect that could be looked at, but we need to make sure we're not compounding the whole issue that we're speaking about here today.
Can I disagree with Lila
No.
at my own personal risk, given how close I am and those big bangles you've got? I disagree on. I disagree slightly. I mean, you're right. Philanthropy is never going to replace. It's never going to fund literacy programs. Or across schools or whatever. But I mean, there is a general desire from the public to support disadvantaged students and disadvantaged communities, and it's often that they don't know how or what avenue. You don't want to get in the way. If you're an individual or a corporation, you don't want to get in the way of what schools are doing. So I think there is a general desire from the community, the vast majority of the community, to do what they can to help disadvantaged students and to bridge this equity divide, whether it's non-English speaking, Aboriginal, rural, remote, whatever it is. So I think there is a role for philanthropy there in terms of satisfying that desire from the community. But secondly, in terms of understanding what the issues are, there's a big difference between data and research. And I always found this as minister, it was often difficult to understand or get advice on what you could, everybody knows what the problem is. Finding the solution is much more difficult. And the role of philanthropy there, whether it's at universities or whatever, it is much more objective research and much more objective advice than if government departments do it. I know the department was often constrained in the terms of things it would do, the research it would do and advice it would give, because there's always a political context to it, whether it was an industrial one or a party political one. It's constrained. Universities and philanthropic groups, institutes like Grattan, they are much more independent in terms of their ability to crunch the data, provide the research, hopefully on some causal relationships as to why things happen and what prescriptions you can apply to deal with them. So I think in both those respects, there is a role for a significant role for philanthropy in dealing with this issue of equity. I'll just give one example.
We're agreeing so far, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know.
Get off my bangles.
Send it through. He's gradually moved further.
And I always wonder about a school. Some of these schools out in remote New South Wales. They have significant resources, but the department, these are department schools. The response is always when they've got more money, is to employ more teachers, and the department's constrained in terms of the advice it can give, because if it suggests doing something outside the award or outside the historic industrial agreements of, teacher salaries or whatever, and that leaked or that got out, there's a huge political drama and the newspapers are all over it. But it actually does need. Jihad wouldn't have touched it in opposition, absolutely not. But there is a role there for that objective research, etc. To have a look at are there actual different physical structural models for delivering schools with the same amount of money? Should you do it differently?
But I think it also, and you sort of open that, we need to look at philanthropy as something more than just money. Somebody might be willing to donate their time, become a mentor to a child, assist them, take someone under their wing. There's other ways that people can donate rather than just in a financial sense. And we need to be careful that it doesn't become the model that you rely on. It's like the cherry on top, so to speak. It shouldn't be the model that if you were one of the lucky schools that had become, had been the recipient of someone's generosity, because you've got maybe a personal connection or whatever it might be, then another school may miss out. And that's why I like the idea of Schools Plus. I think there's one of the greatest things about us as a nation is our egalitarianism and our desire to give back. And I hope we never ever lose that as a nation, because it's actually the best thing that we have. We've got that. We want to help the little, we always back the underdog. That's just in our DNA. So looking at different things, if you're in a really remote school, your opportunity to receive someone's generosity is not there. It's much more limited. So we need to look at other ways that we do it. Whether we've got the Schools Plus, which is very generous. We've got the individual ones. But sometimes if somebody might want to donate some money, I might not know what to do with the money as a principal, but if somebody would say, hey, I can offer this kid a little bit of part-time work. If you've got a kid who really needs some help, or if you've got somebody that you need mentored, some of those things. And I think we need to start looking at things beyond just the dollar figure, because it isn't just about the money. Like, education can't be just about, the money is really important, but it can't be just about the money. And I think Adrian is spot on, and these will be the challenges, that it is a very rigid system, the public education system. And sometimes you might know how you can fix something, but you seek some advice and you're told all the reasons that you can't, but you just go, but it's like it's a common sense fix. And I think that's where it is a little bit problematic. But certainly, I think anybody who's willing to donate and to assist students, and let's remember there are lots of little independent and Catholic schools that are quite poor as well. I mean, sometimes we think about the really wealthy independent ones, but there's a lot who don't charge fees. There's a lot who help kids out. I think it's a good place for it, it's an important place for it, but it actually says a lot about us as an Australian society, but it can't be the thing that we rely on. It's that cherry on the top, I think.
Can I actually add something from another dimension? Some of the best philanthropy I've seen in Australia and in other countries is about philanthropy for teachers, in the sense of special training, special opportunities, and special scholarships. I mean, there's this, some of you will know of the Little Scientists, that when Angela Merkel was out here, who did she want to meet? You know, a very limited number of people, but she wanted to talk to Little Scientists, which is a German foundation for supporting science teachers in, you know, kindergarten to sort of year one, and is spectacular. And I think that can often make quite a difference and tends not to raise some of the problems that Lila's talked about.
I wish we could continue this conversation. We are out of time now, and I do apologise if we didn't get to your question. We had an overwhelming response. There were some really great questions that I'm sorry we didn't get to, but hopefully we touched on what you were hoping to ask through our discussion anyway. I mean, I think the key theme definitely for me, through listening to the amazing stories that Lila told, Jihad told, but also Marion and Adrian, is the amazing impact education can have on transforming lives. But obviously, without doubt, we still have a long way to go. This forum will continue in discussions beyond tonight. The video and podcast will be available in coming weeks. And please join in thanking my esteemed panellists for their contributions, and of course all who
And to Alex, who managed to keep us all under control. I tell you what, you've done well.
Big
had 2 hours worth of
my opportunity here. So I want to thank everyone for this fascinating discussion, passionate, provocative, engaged. But I also would like to take this particular opportunity to thank Alexandra for guiding us through this, and we have a little something for you.
Oh. Oh, thank you. Oh,
yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. They're beautiful.
Happy birthday.
I know, aren't they gorgeous?
Yeah.
And finally, just for each of our panelists, a small gift of recognition. So thank you.
Oh, chocolate. Thanks.
Equitable that we should all get the same gift.
We're
Thank
very,
you.
very equitable on this one.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our panel discussion. You've been a fantastic audience. Thank you for your provocative questions and for your engagement. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.